My name is Greg Peterson. I'm one of the co-founders of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and I'm just thrilled tonight that you could also join us in this kind of a fun evening for me specifically. I'm just glad you're going to be watching this. As for those who attended law school, it was often that professors would be asking questions nonstop of the students. Think paper chase. And tonight, I have a chance to interview my hero, constitutional law professor at Allegheny College, Dr. Robert G. Seddig, who found its way to Allegheny via Carleton College, and then got his doctorate in Princeton, and then came to Meadville and never left. Occasional trips to Maine, but here he is. So I'm just thrilled to have that chance to talk to Dr. Seddig. And in addition, we have Professor Brian Harward, also from Allegheny College, who sits in the Robert G. Seddig Chair, which is an endowed chair at Allegheny, and which is an honor to Dr. Seddig, but also thrilled to have Brian as the successor to Dr. Seddig. So we have the two big shots at Allegheny College when it comes to the world of political science. We're going to learn everything there is to know tonight. This will be the grand disclosure. And the reason I know that is Professor Harward just authored a book called Presidential Power, which is the hot topic. To what extent does the president have inherent powers to do some of the things that he does? And it's a wonderful chronology of the documents which led to that and to the actual authority today. And within that, and we'll no doubt get into that, part of the authority which drives the constitutional review of executive powers is, in fact, an opinion by one Robert H. Jackson, the Youngstown Steel seizure case, and which is the gold standard for determination of whether or not a president has expanded and gone beyond his constitutional limits. That's kind of cool for us. It's great for us to have Allegheny College professors here. We have a long-standing relationship with Allegheny. There's a partnership, memorandum of understanding with Allegheny, and we've done programs there. They've had programs here. They've had interns come here on an ongoing basis, and we'll have likewise the same this summer. So we're incredibly excited about the relationship, and I'm incredibly excited about what's going to happen here in a few minutes. For those interested in Dr. Seddig's book, or Dr. Harward's book, rather, Presidential Power, he brought a few of them up, and they are here, and I think they're $50 a piece. And believe me, if you go on Amazon, it's $100. So this is your deep discount tonight for this opportunity. So with that, one final news note for those that did go to law school and knew anything about Robert Jackson, you couldn't help but read in a section under contracts, promissory estoppel for those lawyers, a section dealing with the Allegheny College case. Allegheny College estoppel case, promissory estoppel, where in fact Robert Jackson represented, I think it was the First National Bank of Jamestown, one of the banks, against Allegheny College, because Allegheny College had the audacity to try to collect on a pledge. You know how you sign those little documents. And Andrew Breyer here, and he'll have pledge cards if you want to test this. So you can sign pledge cards, give $100, and it was the executor of the estate that chose not to honor that. And that was the bank. Guess who represented the bank? Robert Jackson. That case found its way up to the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court. And our guy, Robert Jackson, who we put on a pedestal, lost. He lost to Allegheny College. So now when you sign Andrew Breyer's pledge card, it's now collectible because our guy lost in the Allegheny College case. But that is something that you do read about in really the first few weeks of law school. So with that, I'm going to pause and have an opportunity to talk to two of my favorite folks. So, Dr. Seddig, who are you voting for in the upcoming election?
Why?
No. He told me not to ask that question. So, but you know that begs the question, because talking about the polarization of politics and inevitably what's going on today, just generally, where it's so personal, it's so polarized. And we're maybe off topic a little bit, but that's definitely tonight. I think there is a Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are going at each other in Brooklyn. What's your sense of that as, and I'm sure either one want to lead, but as you've chronicled all of the politics, and I know you've written extensively and read about that, do you get a sense of where we are in a timeline of stuff? Is this the lead-in? Okay, all right, here we go. This is a political science professor, man. Here we go.
I think it might be a good idea as we begin the topic of political polarization to have Dr. Brian Harward say a little bit about some of the data which we've put on the screen here, and then we can go from there. I might want to say a little bit about, and this comes not from me so much as from the reading I've been doing, and I know all of you are doing this reading too. I might want to say a little bit about, or we can discuss, the possible redefinition that the Republican Party is going through. But would you be willing to begin with this? Was very, Dr. Harward shared this with me a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about polarization, and these are some data that I think give us a kind of sense of that polarization and the underpinnings which are a part of it. So if I could defer to you.
Yes, okay. So this is a graph that comes from voteview.com, which is a website run by Keith Poole, University of Georgia. He has collected roll call votes on every member of Congress, every House member, every senator since 1789 forward, and is able to map them ideologically over time. And so the data that you're seeing, the lines that you're seeing, if you can see from the back, I know it's probably small for you up there, but the Republican line is the blue line at the top, and then the Democrats are separated into Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and then the median Democratic position. These are the party medians on a liberal to conservative continuum. So if you look at the vertical axis, liberal is low and conservative is at the top, and then it's by time, by year across the bottom. And one thing that obviously is rather striking is the divergence, the huge divergence we see between the party medians at this point in time in 2016. It's the highest degree of polarization since Reconstruction. Another thing, though, that's important to keep in mind is not to get too excited about that particular dynamic at work here, but to recognize that that dip in the middle, in the 50s, early 60s, may be the anomaly. It may very well be that that's the anomalous situation, not the heightened polarization, because as you look at it, you see that divergence replicated at the turn of the century earlier. So, but this is just meant to demonstrate the degree to which the parties have never been more separated since Reconstruction. But the other thing that's interesting to note is that they're clustered around their medians in a greater degree than they've ever been as well. So there's increased party cohesion around those medians at the same time that there's increased party heterogeneity between the two parties, right? Does that make sense to you? So what that means then is if I graph these data differently, I would show you that if you think about all Democrats being clustered here, or all Republicans being clustered here, and all Democrats being clustered here, there is no overlap. There's no Republican that's more conservative than, or that's more liberal than the Democrat is conservative. There's no one person that sits in that space. That's not the common. That's has been something that's only arrived to us since about the mid-90s or so, at a time when Southern Democrats were making the Republicans and the Democratic parties much more of a mix, right? There was a time when conservative Democrats were voting much like Republicans, right? And many Northern Republicans were voting much like Democrats. And so there was much more heterogeneity of preferences at an earlier time. So this partisanship that we're seeing in the House and Senate is replicated. There's a tandem polarization that's occurring and to go into the contemporary politics, we look at it, and the appointees or nominees to Supreme Court maps exactly onto that, which is really interesting. So there's a tandem polarization that's happening, so that you see how the Democrats are rather flat from 1937 forward, and Republicans are rather flat, and then after the Civil Rights era, they split off. Well, that is the same if we have ideological measures for nominees to the Supreme Court. It maps exactly onto that. So Republican nominees do that same thing, and Democratic nominees remain rather flat. And so it's an interesting tandem polarization that's happening, even though the two shouldn't be necessarily that connected. They are. And that's an interesting area for a future comp, perhaps, that one of the students could take up.
By the way, there is one person that does fit that category of both, because you said there was no one person, but Bruce Janowski sitting here is, in fact, that person. So if you want to get his autograph as that island unto himself, that's him.
Well, there aren't many, Bruce.
So translate this into the current politics of today. I mean, you got the presidential primaries going on. Does that play out today?
So I don't want to continue.
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
So the effect of this, of course, is kind of obvious, right? That what this means is that major legislation is going to require supermajorities, because in order to get anything done, the Democrats can't go it alone, obviously, and so they're going to require Republican votes. But that means going really far along that continuum over to reach the 60th senator to overcome the filibuster. And so supermajorities are going to be required for major legislation, for nominees and others. And so that's really problematic. What that means is that congressional, in the context of presidential power, it means that congressional reaction to presidential prerogative, presidential power, exertions of presidential authority, congressional reaction is going to be stymied. The likelihood of that is going to be rather low because they can't get their act together to get that done. And what that means then is that the reaction, the incentive that presidents have to go it alone is going to be higher. And so, in fact, we've seen that, right? I mean, we've seen lots of occasions in recent years where presidents have simply circumvented Congress because Congress wasn't able to get their act together, or they were going to be unable to respond. So why not go it alone in some respects? And so congressional reaction to presidential unilateralism is really thwarted in a polarized era, and that matters for constitutionalism.
So, Dr. Seddig, you set up the scene very well regarding the presidential actions that he sees Congress. We're talking institutional gridlock, especially if they're separate parties. And therefore, one of his tools is to exercise his inherent powers as President of the United States, which is what Brian has talked about in his book. Can you kind of brief us a little bit how maybe in your classes you talk about that? Back in my day, you talked about the inherent power of the President of the United States vis-a-vis the constitutional limitations.
Well, I think one of the things which people don't know too much about, and maybe even I don't know too much about, so I would defer to my colleague here, are executive orders. And executive orders are one of the means by which presidents can engage in effecting policies or creating policies which don't necessarily involve a circumvention, but which involved a kind of acting on a mandate to accomplish something. What I wanted to say, going back a few minutes, about this chart, I've been interested in polarization and paralysis and the absence of consensus building. And one of the questions which has gone through my mind, because I'm interested in earlier party eras too, is whether we are in a period right now of greater polarization than maybe we were following the Civil War, or maybe a greater polarization than we were in the transition from the Adams presidency to Jeffersonianism and so on. And I think all of you know this, but what political scientists and what Dr. Harward has done here is to come up with ways of using data to try to get at polarization and speak about that polarization in ways that have some support or some substantiation to them. So I've found this to be very useful, not only with respect to Congress, but also with respect to judicial nominations and judicial appointments. This is what many of you did senior projects or comps. This is what we like to call getting at the operationalization of, or the defining in ways that have data support for expressing polarization and so on. It also has implications, of course, for what we all seem to want right now in a very passionate way, and that is consensus building. This has definite, very definite implications for the difficulties of party consensus building and maybe ideological consensus building in Congress.
Does this chart tell us that the days of the moderate Republican is over? That group of six that somehow, you know, they found ways to try to build consensus, and if there is so much polarization that chart would indicate, that what a useless exercise.
I don't know if this chart tells us that, but recent experiences would demonstrate that they are in a frightful position. I mean, they run in fear of being primaried. That is a challenge from the House Freedom Caucus wing, right? So, you know, someone like, well, Rob Portman or others is in a precarious position where it really has to pay attention to in the primaries to a challenge from someone who reflects that House Freedom Caucus, you know, divergent perspective, and frankly, because they'll lose their seat. And there's been many people who have good reason to fear that. And so that's what this tells us, is that voters in those districts, in the House anyway, are sending messages to incumbents that they certainly want a change.
Why is there only one Republican bracket and three for the Democrat?
I'm sorry, what was it?
The question is, why is there three separate Democrat lines and a single Republican line?
Oh, because that represents discrete categories within the Democratic Party over that time period.
Right, but why aren't there three in the Republican?
Because there isn't the same kind of, there wasn't historically that same kind of divergence between, like.
But you're talking about that right now, that divergence.
Okay, yeah, well, but there wasn't there's not a regionalism to Tea Party Republicans, right? And they don't trace back to 1870. I mean, so I guess my point is that the vote view data is separated the Democrats because the Democrats are the ones that create that difference. They shift away from the Republican Party position.
So is it safe to say that until the recent advent of the Tea Party, that conservative wing, where the concern is the Republicans against Republicans being primaried, as opposed to losing a seat as much as losing to a seat to a Democrat? So the game is really played at the primary level. And that is a fairly new phenomenon, isn't it?
I can't say, I mean, being primaried from the right for the Republicans, I mean, sure, this is something that's much more salient now than perhaps it had been before. Yeah.
So if I'm the President of the United States and I look at this and I get pretty discouraged about legislation, pretty discouraged about taking my agenda forward, and again, back to the question we asked Dr. Seddig, one of the tools is to, in fact, use executive orders. And I don't either one. I want to kind of do a little bit of a history, because I know your book deals with that inherent power.
I guess I would say the lesson I take from that, and so I'm not a scholar of constitution or of member behavior in the House or the Senate. That's not what I do. What I do is look at the what that might mean for presidents, right? And so that heightened polarization, as I said, creates the likelihood of inaction from Congress being quite high. And what that means is, if in our constitutional system, rule of law is structured by the political context. And if that political context is such that one chamber, one power, the Congress, is enfeebled, then there's opportunity there for presidents to take advantage of that lassitude. And so that in some respects, the constitutional system is imperiled by heightened polarization. And it doesn't have to be executive orders, it doesn't have to be claims of inherent power, because presidents could always make inherent claims. But it's regular day-to-day kind of politics gets shifted. And because Congress is essentially unable to overcome the difficulties that supermajorities require, then it really privileges presidents in that politics of structure, right? The politics of not just the policy, but the actual structure of government. To what degree do presidential signing statements or executive orders generate a response from Congress? And we find that, in fact, Congress does respond, and often responds quite effectively by holding hearings, introducing new legislation, and taking actions to hold agencies to congressional preference rather than presidential preference. And we find that actually, there's some evidence to support that that's what happens. So it doesn't necessarily take, to get to Bruce's question, it doesn't necessarily take consensus. It takes creating a context where Congress sees it in their interest to respond to presidential activity. And in some respects, in some issue areas, Congress is likely to respond. In other issue areas, they don't. The polarization and as I said, the inability of Congress to overcome that in many respects doesn't have to be, again, to Bruce's point, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. But when it becomes a bad thing is when it gets dumb, it becomes such that Congress, even when it wants to, can't overcome presidential imperialism. And Congress, therefore, then loses an obligation it has institutionally to thwart presidential prerogative. And so there's nothing to stop. If Congress is unable to react, independent of who the president is, there's nothing to stop Congress, to stop that president. Courts aren't going to do it. It takes Congress. It takes active behavior from Congress. And hearings may not be sufficient, right? And only a sufficiently motivated Congress can overcome the polarization. That's a really high hurdle. So it doesn't take consensus, but it takes a willingness to do that. And I just don't see, I don't see that being a very easy thing for this Congress to do, independent of who's president.
The president signs an executive order. It then finds its way, we talk about it, on occasion it finds its way to the Supreme Court. Dr. Seddig, how does that happen? Who actually sues the president to overturn an executive order as being unconstitutional, as beyond his inherent powers?
Well, just off the top of my head, I would say that to challenge the constitutionality of an executive order, there has to be some kind of an aggrieved party who would be adversely affected or harmfully affected by the policy content of the executive order. In order for that party to have initially standing to sue. But I prefer to talk about that in terms of some specific case, and I don't have one.
Well, take the Sawyer case. Take the Youngstown Steel seizure. There's the classic President Harry Truman feels in 1952, I believe, exercises his inherent powers to take over the steel industry. It impacts
through his Secretary of Commerce.
Right.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So he gets against the Youngstown Steel seizure, or young sheet and tube. So they're the aggrieved party. They've lost ownership, essentially, to Sawyer. So that's the aggrieved party. They sue the Secretary of Commerce. It then finds itself as a justiciable action now before the Supreme Court. Ironically, before you respond, we had the opportunity here, because that is such a pivotal case, where we had all of the law clerks of the justices who were part of that expedited case here to talk about that case. But can you give us kind of a synopsis of what happened there?
Are you familiar enough with that case to?
I can give it a shot.
Yeah,
you go first.
No, you go.
All right.
You're in the Seddig chair. When he says do it, do it.
Yeah.
I would be happy. I know the contours of the
There
case.
you go. Give the contours. Give the contours.
No, you go ahead.
No, I want the contours.
Oh.
Go ahead.
This case, which is often called the Steele seizure case, raises questions about the scope of executive authority through an executive action of this kind to, quote, seize the steel mills. It has implications not only for the powers of President Truman and his Secretary of Commerce, but also implications for property rights and corporate rights. And it's a very rich case in the sense that it raises questions not only about the interface between government and business, government and corporations, but also issues of power, separation of powers, and the extent to which this kind of action might come constitutionally from a president or the executive branch or from some kind of congressional initiative of one sort or another. And then there, of course, is the backdrop of wartime concerns during the Cold War. So it's a kaleidoscope of constitutional issues that are before the Vincent Court.
It is a. May I jump in? It's a rich. You are right. It's a rich case, and there's lots to really interesting about it, and many of you perhaps know it well as well. But Truman took these actions not because he felt that not because he cited any statutory basis to take the actions, nor any constitutional basis to take the action. He took the action because he thought that it was within the inherent power of the presidency to take this action. And that's only happened a few times in the country's history where presidents have claimed, I'm taking this action because I'm president, rather than looking for a statutory or constitutional basis to exercise that power. So that's one thing. It's a presidential power on the basis of, or presidential action that's on the basis of inherent power. So outside of a text, which is important and meaningful, certainly to the court. Another issue is that it wasn't declared war. This was the first time the president had put troops into harm's way without a declaration of war, and then took actions that he said were during wartime when there hadn't been a formal declaration of war. Now, Truman's response was that, well, I'm doing this under the auspices of the United Nations, and this was a police action, not wartime. Nonetheless, I have to do this for national security purposes. However, just a few years earlier, Congress had written a law called the Taft-Hartley Act, which gave the president, and someone else can help me here, but I don't know the particulars of it, but gave the president the authority to require a cooling off period for labor disputes. So it was an 80-day period, grace period, where without actually nationalizing the steel mills, he could have just called for that cooling off period under the Taft-Hartley Act. But the difficulty is that he had vetoed that act and couldn't be seen to be running afoul of unions, which had supported his candidacy. So he was really, and he wasn't a very popular president at the time, and so he was really in a bit of a pickle. He was just factually wrong on that this was during wartime, and he also could have used other means, less aggressive means, to get the same kind of result, suspending invoking the Taft-Hartley Act. So all of this is to say that black would have none of it. You want to get to the decision? Or
No, go ahead.
yeah. So black writes
Because
the
we're
majority.
just setting this up for Robert Jackson.
That
I
was
just
too
want
much.
you to know this
That was
is-
too much. Right. So black writes the opinion that nobody remembers, and then Jackson writes the concurrence.
And he said, do you recall? The
Yeah.
three
So,
zones?
Yeah. So well, I do. But he,
It's in your book.
Well, yeah. I didn't write that part.
Yeah, right here, here it is. 'Cause I'm
But you have it
gonna-
highlighted, please, Greg. You have it highlighted.
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm good to go, buddy.
Save me. Go ahead. What does he say? 3 points.
Okay, here we go. 3 points. And this, as before I read this, and the reason this is the gold standard is because Chief Justices who've been here, Rehnquist, Roberts, and then we've had O'Connor and Ginsburg and Kennedy, all say so. Therefore, I believe it. As far as the Supreme Court's review of the inherent power of the executive and the analysis the Supreme Court must go through. 1, when the President acts pursuant to an express or an implied authorization of Congress, his authority is at its maximum, for it includes all that he possesses in his own right plus all that Congress can delegate. When the President acts in absence of either a congressional grant or denial of authority Congress has enacted, he can only rely upon his own independent powers, but there is a zone of twilight in which he and Congress may have concurrent authority or in which distribution is uncertain. Therefore, congressional inertia, indifference, or quiescence may sometimes, at least as a practical matter, enable it, if not invite, measures on independent presidential responsibilities. In this area, any actual test of powers likely depend on the imperatives of events and contemporary imponderables rather than abstract theories of law. And when the President takes measures incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. For then he can rely only upon his own constitutional powers minus any constitutional powers of Congress over the matter. And it's really that last piece where they concluded, because of the Taft-Hartley Act, that you had this cooling off period and the Congress had acted. And when Congress had acted to the negative to what he did, that's when Jackson and the others.
And then never again did Congress assert itself.
That's right.
So yes, it's the gold standard that has never been followed.
It comes up usually detentions that have occurred in Guantanamo Bay and some other related things. But yeah, ultimately you got gridlock. You got this great gold standard, and that's the way it'll be, seemingly for a long period of time.
Well, so there, can I say something? No?
Oh, yeah.
So if you think about presidential power and as in terms of, as Greg has in the introduction talked about, as sort of an arc, a trajectory of presidential power, and it's true, there's been certainly an accretion of presidential power over time, such that, and Schlesinger was famous for saying this, that as he was writing, Nixon was a culmination, not an aberration. And that's an important point. That's an important principle. And there are several reasons for that, I think, that not just in Nixon's case, but in the case of Bush or Obama, is that these accretions happen. One, the accrual of presidential power over time is, there's several reasons. One is precedential, and Jackson himself made that point in the Korematsu case. When he dissented, he said that this power will lay about like a loaded weapon waiting for a future executive to use for less important means, right? And that is prophetic in the sense that of this arc of presidential power over time. But one of the reasons it's been allowed to accrue like that is because the text, the Constitution, Article 2, is deliberately ambiguous. Madison very much wanted a clear articulation of what are the powers that presidents have, and in that articulation there would be a constraint then placed upon executives. And Hamilton prevailed and said, no, we want it to be vague, we want it to be ambiguous, we want it to change and adjust to times. And so that Hamiltonian perspective, as I said, became the dominant perspective. So that's one reason, it's textual, that in that ambiguity presidents will push. as ambitious politicians will do, especially in times of national security crises. And so in that ambiguity is that kind of dynamism and flexibility in the office of the president itself. And then just by nature of being an executive, there are institutional advantages that the president has vis-a-vis Congress and the courts, such that presidents have information asymmetries. They have more information. They have national security advisors. They have a whole apparatus around them. They have budgeting priorities. They are first movers in legislation. They propose, and then Congress acts on legislation. So there's all kinds of advantages that have, well, since 1937 or so, roughly, have really come to animate the presidency. And then finally, I would say that Congress has enabled that in really important ways, not the least of which is the growth of the federal bureaucracy through the violations, routine violations of the non-delegation doctrine, which would be Congress passing laws, establishing agencies to, in the case of the Federal Communications Corporation, for example, to regulate in the public interest, or for OSHA, or in other ways that privilege executive power. So I'd say those, at least those four things.
Dr. Seddig?
If you read the Constitution of the United States, I think all of us are struck by the extensive enumeration of powers associated with the Congress of the United States. Then when you go to executive power in Article 2, the enumeration diminishes somewhat and the ambiguity increases with the clause which states the president shall take care that the laws of the United States be faithfully executed. And then, of course, when you go to the third article, which is concerned with judicial power, there's practically no explication at all of what judicial powers are. There's a statement to the effect that judicial powers are vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as Congress may, from time to time, establish. But I think I'm on solid ground here in saying that the founders believed that the principal policy-making, law-writing branch of government would be the legislature. And over time, for reasons that Dr. Harward just mentioned, the executive authority, perhaps responding to exigencies associated with national security or economic calamity, have called upon presidents to assert that authority, even in its ambiguity, and have enlarged the enumerated, you might say, and implied or inherent powers of the presidency. Whether this begins, well, it probably began with Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. I don't know. But whether it begins with Woodrow Wilson or whether it begins with Franklin Roosevelt and the creation of the New Deal programs, one could probably argue about that.
So, and this, again, this just echoes Jackson's own hand in Youngstown Sheet and Tube when he makes a distinction between the paper powers that a president has and the real powers that presidents exercise. And he, better than most, was in a position to know what the real powers of the presidency were, having served those presidents.
As you sit here today, we just talked about this analytical review. Can you philosophically say, are we in a good position?
A good position with respect to governing, or?
Well, yeah, here we are today. We kind of identified that we've got this gridlock, we've got this polarization. We are where we are in 2016. Are we in a good place vis-a-vis, say, go back to FDR in a continuum? Are we, and again, it's a philosophical question, but I'd be curious as to your perspective. I mean, Dr. Seddig, you've been teaching since 1967. That was LBJ's time period. We've had some personalities through that time period, which many of them have enhanced the power of the presidency.
Well, if you go back to Madison and read what Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers about auxiliary checks on the primary powers of government, I think we all know that there were structural limitations placed upon governing that were motivated by a fear of excessive majoritarianism or tyranny. It's kind of hard for me to know whether that system of checks and balances is in fact or has taken us too far. I don't think that no governing is certainly a good idea. And I was thinking when the gentleman asked the question about, or made the comment about no governing, it's very important for the process. I'm just thinking of one aspect of congressional responsibility. It's very important. What? It's very important for Congress to exercise its authority with respect to budgeting and appropriations. And I think there's been a really palpable and disappointing abdication of responsibility with respect to these money-related matters, which the Constitution clearly places in the hands of the Congress of the United States. And we've certainly seen this. I don't want to get off now necessarily into Pennsylvania politics, but we've certainly seen this in Pennsylvania over the course of the last several months. There are, irrespective of one's perspective on governing and the extensiveness of governing, there are certain basic responsibility, institutional responsibilities, which lie, I believe, with the presidency, with the Congress, and with the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. And the abdication of those responsibilities, irrespective of one's ideological position, is untenable.
Do you agree, Brian?
Yeah, I think maybe a month ago, David Brooks had an interesting piece about the anti-politics crowd in Washington. I don't know if some of you saw that, but his concern was that this isn't what's happening. In particular, he was laying at the feet of the House Freedom Caucus, I think, and Trump. He was talking about Trump, obviously, in some respects. But his argument, as I understood it, and this has been a while since I even thought about it, but his argument was that this anti-politics crowd is not just against the size of government, which is pretty routine for Republicans, right? It's not about that. It's against governance itself, and that's problematic. And so I guess to respond, Bruce, to your question earlier about, yes, it's important to have responsible parties, I think, in some respects. I think that's one of the things that animates us as political scientists, is we care that there are differences between representatives, and those differences ought to be articulated, and they ought to matter in debates over policy. And they ought to matter in exchanges between the House and the Senate and the President. But when some are fundamentally opposed to the act of governance itself, that is, being responsible parties to governance, and seek to undermine at every occasion any opportunity for there to be a meaningful policy outcome, that's problematic. And I don't think that I don't object to Republicans controlling the House, or Republicans controlling the Senate, or Democrats controlling the presidency. I object to people who are fundamentally opposed to responsible government.
Accurately argued that one of the primary reasons we see this divergence in the two parties and the inaction is that we've institutionalized the actions of government, in the sense that we have professional politicians, in that it's no longer that person serving for a few terms and trying to influence to the positive his or her viewpoint what decisions are being made at government. What we have people who've made it their careers. And the best way to stay elected for a career is to not get tagged with anything. Make no decision in which you can be accurately held accountable for. So as a result, what you do is you retreat back to a safe harbor. And what we really have is almost a feudal system where you have your kingdoms and your moats and your barriers and everything. You try to stay within that, and then you just periodically go out and try and steal a little bit of your neighbor's land or his food or whatever, then quickly retreat back to your safe harbor, because the decisions of whether you're elected or not basically take place in the primary world. And there's very little places like Chautauqua County where there's an almost equal distribution of Republicans and Democrats, and people really vote with their heads and all those sorts of things. So as a result, it drives you into these differences in opinion, because you don't dare find that middle ground, because you're going to lose that career you want to have for life as a congressman, a senator, or whatever. And then the president comes typically out of that machinery and establishes some mechanism to get into that chair. And that's what's really, for me, driving a very interesting political process in this particular election, because you have Bernie Sanders out there really catching fire with some terribly dissatisfied folks who happen to share portions of his opinion. And you have Donald Trump capturing tremendous support because people are so dissatisfied with these career folks making these career decisions in the legislature, proposing more and more and more, and then the president's stuck trying to manage what's left of his capacity to make decisions. Could any of that impact on that slide, and I'll back up 100 steps and say, I'm also curious about what does really a movement of a 0.02 mean in that slide, without real context. But could that factor that people make their lives and livelihoods of being politicians?
It strikes me, though, that at least in the context of the argument that David Brooks was making, please go read it. Don't rely on me, because I'm totally wrong, I'm sure. But my recollection of it was that it's actually professional politicians, sorry, Bruce, that are the solution, not the amateurs. And the reason he makes that argument is because amateurs go in there, and he's talking specifically about the House Freedom Caucus, the people who came in with an agenda with respect to the Tea Party agenda and are now leaving. And they have burned the House down upon their departure. And that's what concerns him. So he's saying what we need is more professionalism. What we need is, and he doesn't say this, but I would take him to mean, really, let's make institutional changes in the chamber, in particularly the House, I guess he would say, or perhaps in the Senate too, that would actually let people stay there and invest in that chamber, in the professionalism of that chamber. So think about, one of the things that happened recently was the eradication of earmarks. Well, earmarks serve an important purpose. I mean, I know everyone likes to make, to say how bad they are, and pork barrel funding, right, is a really terrible thing. But that's just moving money around that's already been budgeted. It's not new money necessarily, right? So it's money that's already been budgeted. It's just changing where it goes into the lines. And so the earmarks, that was the grease of compromise. And without that grease, there's very little, it becomes zero sum rather than positive sum. Every interaction I have and every win I have is at your expense. Why would you compromise with me? Well, let's let earmarks then be that grease, for example. The way that they are constantly trying to get money, they're constantly on the phone trying to drum up money to beat back a challenge, that really has dramatic effects for how they spend their time together. There are very few opportunities for members of Congress to get to know one another, to interact, to play basketball like they used to. So there are institutional differences at work. The caucuses aren't meeting together, they're meeting separately in their enclaves. And one thing we know is you go into your enclave, you're not exposed to the deep well of ideas that another alternative perspective may provide. You're then only sorting through options from this very shallow pool. And so that probably contributes to it too. And so I would say that, I don't want to speak for, obviously, anyone else, but I would say that a solution to this problem could be institutional change, but also professionalism that would come along with institutional change.
I think another big piece in that Brooks article was civility and getting along. And even though you might be totally opposed to the other side, you're willing to meet at least and talk and find some bit of common ground and be able to go back to your constituents and say, listen, I've held my ground, I'm doing what I can for you, but at the same time, I have to do something with the guy from on the other aisle, and they're not doing that now. They're not civil with each other.
One thing, I'm sorry, I have something to say about this, but one thing that comes to mind, something I talked to my students today about, and I'm not sure if it was the con law class or the philosophy of law class, but the learned hand once said that the spirit of liberty is the spirit to recognize that one might not have the truth. And it's a very humble spirit. And Judge Hand's point was that we have to come to public deliberation with the humility that we might not be right. And if we did that, and I think you're right, I think that was Brooks's point, that if we did that, and we recognize the humanity of the opposition, we may have some opportunity to get something done.
Well, one of the initiatives that was accomplished for a couple years during a time period in which our congressman here in Chautauqua County, Emil Houghton, tried was to annually have a meeting of all congressmen in Hershey. He, together, I think with John Lewis, may have been the two of them that sponsored. They tried it for a couple of years with that effort in mind. It was a wonderful start, and our Congressman Houghton believed in that immensely, but I don't think it got a lot of traction. I mean, it was an excellent effort, but it didn't get a lot of traction. Polarization of politics. Your book, Presidential Power. Can you pull that all together here?
Yeah. So this is a book about constitutionalism and the rule of law. And the argument that I make in the book is that constitutionalism, constitutional meaning, is only understood in the context of political contestation. That reference to the text alone is insufficient to understand the real powers that presidents have. Presidents have those powers in relationship to Congress and the courts. And so the famous adage is it's like the hole in the donut. Right? The donut of what's permissible can expand. Right? The hole can get bigger and bigger if Congress is unwilling to take a reaction. If Congress is unable to respond, such as in a highly polarized context, that wasn't the case in 1952, and then we have opportunities for increased presidential power, and that limits the constitutional form, even if Congress wanted to. They were really denied an opportunity to make effective differences in constraining executive power.
By the way, this is a spectacular book drawing that whole chronological view of executive powers, its growth, and he's done such a great job in footnoting it and highlighting and bringing it to a real user-friendly basis. And so I commend you, Brian, for adding this to the literature, body of literature that we have. Dr. Seddig, you had a chance to write a couple of articles for the Supreme Court Historical Society way back when.
Well, I wrote an article quite a while ago on the origins of leadership in the office of Chief Justice of the United States. And probably that's an article which has given me a great deal of interest in the institutional interaction among the justices and the way in which both chiefs and associate justices have exercised leadership, intellectual leadership, doctrinal leadership, and even interpersonal leadership on the Supreme Court. That's one of my passionate areas of interest about the Supreme Court.
So we have a Chief Justice Roberts, who was at the Jackson Center a few years ago. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of his interpersonal relationship with his fellow justices?
Well, I'd have to do, I think, a little bit of reading, additional reading, before I answered that question in a way which would be definitive and fair.
Well, that's a very political answer. Wow, he would never have accepted that from us in his class, let me assure you. So what's next for you, Brian? You've accomplished this. How long did it take you, by the way, to do this book?
A year.
Yeah.
Every Friday for a year.
Is that right?
Yep.
So what's next?
I have a new book contract for a 3-volume series on the history of political parties and interest groups in American politics.
Timely. Timely. And that's supposed to be concluded, your contract says that's concluded when?
2018, February 2018. It'll never happen. Don't record that.
Yeah.
Brian, can you explain your process when you say every Friday?
I'm sorry?
Can you explain your process when you say every Friday?
The writing process.
Yeah.
So I teach, right? That's my job, and so and then I have kids and other things, and we have
A wife,
expected
by the way,
right?
yeah, wife.
And we have an expectation of office hours, and so the week really gets, like all of us, right? Gets pretty hectic. And so what I did was, when I decided that this is what I wanted to do, I thought, well, the only way that's going to happen is if I can find time away to do it. And so I just, for a year, didn't make any appointments, any meetings, which is really a privilege to be able to do that. For nothing on Friday except writing. And I think I spent a couple Fridays up here. But Jackson, as you'll see if you get a chance to look at it, and you don't have to buy it, just look at it, figures really prominently in this. I mean, Jackson sits at the beginning of this book and frames the whole argument in many ways because of his concurrence in Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And so I had an energy for it, because I was in this mix. I was interacting with our students who had been up here. I was teaching classes related to Jackson. I was constantly reminded of what I hadn't yet done. So there was always this pull. And frankly, I teach courses on this. And so something would come to mind in a conversation with students, or a student project would emerge around something, and I would have energy for it, and I'd learn a bit more about it, and then it would go in. And so it became a very natural extension of the classroom and my own interests generally. In fact, when I first had this idea, I sent it to Greg and a couple other people, and I said, I think this is something that you at the Jackson Center really ought to know about, because I'm excited about it, and it's all because of Jackson.
Now, have you met Marion Beckerink, who's Director of Development of the Jackson Center? Because it is all about Jackson, you know. Nice lead-in. Dr. Seddig, you've taught for so many years. 1967 is when it really all got started. And you have your protege here, in Dr. Harward. What's your message to him as he's launched? He's launched. But he's young, he's got direction, he's got energy. If you had to sit back and, with an appropriate glass of libation, saying, Brian, here's my recommendation for what you might consider in the next 10 years, what would you say?
I would say that I've been in Professor Harward's classes, and he doesn't need any message from me. He's wonderful. He explains things very clearly and with great passion. And that is the nature of who he is, and that's what's important. He is himself. And all of us who teach, I think more than anything else, need to be ourselves and who we are.
Well, let me just say, from a personal testimony, and I'm sure there's an awful lot of folks who came here tonight because of you, talking about teaching clearly and with passion and inspiration, which led to an awful lot of us folks to get into the professions that we got into. We thank you personally, and I'm thrilled that you came up here today and to be part of this as well. And to Brian and your connectiveness here with the Jackson Center and all that you've accomplished and what you've just said is meaningful to us. It also gives us a sense of legacy that, in fact, some part of our mission, in fact, finds outlets through books like yours, through students like yours, that are hopefully will, in fact, make an incredible difference in our community. And to all the folks, many of them here are from Allegheny College. Again, I'd like to thank them all for all of your continued encouragement, support of the college, and which have resulted in two superstars like Dr. Seddig and Dr. Harward. So on behalf of all of us, thank you. This has been terrific.
Thank you.
Before Bruce leaves, I want to make sure that we come down here, we're going to turn the lights up, and whoever has a camera or two, we're going to take pictures of the Allegheny alums. So come down here. Doug and Gordy, you get to sit in the front because you're senior citizens, you know.